With Steve McMichael getting inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in August this year, I thought it would be a good time to go back and reflect on his work as a pro wrestler. When you think about it, Steve actually accomplished more than a typical wrestler working for WCW during the mid-90s, mainly becoming the company's US champion and also becoming a member of the legendary Four Horsemen group, though what many people recall when bringing up Steve's career was his overall lack of wrestling ability. We're going to be honest here and say Steve McMichael wasn't a good in-ring performer. He was somewhat clumsy in the ring when it came to performing moves and taking bumps, but in a way, this is what also made him a little more endearing as the years went on. Many of Steve's peers also fully admit that McMichael wasn't a good performer, but those same peers also say that Steve tried extremely hard. He put in a lot of effort to try and become better, and his heart was definitely in the right place. So with this knowledge in mind, we can kinda give Steve a bye ball. His lack of in-ring ability almost becomes charming in a way, and he certainly made up for these shortcomings by becoming such a loud and boisterous character on TV. So let's take a look at Steve's pro wrestling career along with his career highlights. Steve made his name as a defensive tackle for the Chicago Bears. There's other channels on YouTube who could tell you a lot more about his football career, and I'd simply be reading other people's work if I were to even try to cover what he did in the NFL. So I'm going to stick with what I know, and that's pro wrestling. He ended his football career with the Green Bay Packers for one season before retiring in 1994, and because Vince McMahon was bringing in Lawrence Taylor of the New York Giants for a match against Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11, Steve got the opportunity to stand in Taylor's corner as the All-Pros went to war with Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation. Steve actually commentated during an episode of Raw, and on the same episode, he brawled with Kama Mustafa. This happened before WrestleMania 11, and I'm guessing Steve got the wrestling bug during this brief stint with the WWF. After Mania 11, and after Vince had finished up his business with Lawrence Taylor, Steve, nor anyone associated with the NFL Pro Team, was brought back to the WWF. As fate would have it, Eric Bischoff was about to launch WCW Nitro a few months after Mania, so Bischoff gave McMichael a job as a full-time commentator on this new and fresh pro wrestling TV show. Eric had no intentions of putting Steve inside the ring. Bischoff saw McMichael as an opportunity to gain some name recognition, plus he liked Steve's style of commentary. He kind of leveled out the Nitro commentary team, with Eric being the straight, no-nonsense play-by-play guy, Bobby Heenan being the guy who favoured company heels, and Steve favouring the babyfaces while also giving Bobby Heenan a hard time for the brain's hot takes on commentary. Steve would also bring his little chihuahua to TV with him every week, Little Pepe, and Pepe was dressed in a wide range of different outfits for each and every episode of Monday Nitro. Heenan didn't think much of the dog, but Steve loved Little Pepe, and it was kind of funny seeing this big football player from Texas carrying around his tiny little dog who wore ridiculous outfits. As for his overall commentary and how he came across on TV, he was okay. Steve will never go down as one of the all-time great commentators, and sometimes he could ramble on quite a bit, but he did understand what pro wrestling was all about. He knew the storylines, he kept up with the characters and their motives. He wasn't one for calling moves or talking about the history of pro wrestling, but really that wasn't his job either. He was there to tame Bobby Heenan when the brain got a little too gung-ho about his favourite bad guys, and Heenan was always there to tell Steve why he was wrong. Steve's then wife Deborah would get introduced to WCW audiences, and the Nature Boy Ric Flair took a liking to Mrs. McMichael. Flair approached Deborah on more than one occasion while she sat at ringside, and of course, Steve took exception to this. McMichael knew he couldn't take on Ric Flair one-on-one, he knew the Horseman would get involved, and so he enlisted the help of football player Kevin Green. The stage was set for McMichael to make his in-ring debut in a tag team match against Ric Flair and Arn Anderson at the 1996 Great American Bash, and it's been said that Steve wanted to have this match because he missed the physicality of pro football. He felt he could do more within WCW. In storyline, both Kevin Green and Steve were trained by Macho Man Randy Savage. However, McMichael was actually trained by Terry Taylor in the WCW power plant. His training was also evidently fast-tracked, but we'll come back to that in a moment. I absolutely loved Kevin Green when he was in WCW. I have no idea what he was like as a pro footballer or how he handled himself in interviews and whatnot, but he had a scary amount of enthusiasm when showing up to WCW Nitro, and I particularly liked a backstage skit featuring McMichael and Green going over their game plan for the Great American Bash. Clearly, these guys needed help. They were coming up with spots to perform in the ring the same way a football coach would go over plays, but it just wasn't coming together for the two footballers. Kevin was chewing on a Slim Jim when he got a fantastic idea, and this is how Macho Man Randy Savage was brought in as the on-screen trainer for Kevin and Steve. Now, we've had a lot of ex-footballers who successfully made the transition into pro wrestling. Wahoo McDaniel, Ernie Ladd, Ron Simmons, Lex Luger, Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, just to name a few. It's certainly not unheard of for ex-footballers to do well in pro wrestling. When it came to Kevin Green, he wasn't bad at all, and with more training, you could have envisioned him one day being a full-time pro wrestler. He had a lot of character, he could talk well on the microphone, and he wasn't afraid to throw himself in the deep end when it came to his ring work. He certainly wasn't magnificent in the ring or anything, but more training could have been hugely beneficial. The exact same thing goes for Steve McMichael. Steve had a ton of character and his promo delivery was very unique, but when it came to actually performing in the ring, he would make mistakes fairly often, and that's because he just didn't have the same amount of training time as his peers. Now, in saying that, this debut match was carefully planned out and it actually went fine. The crowd were into it and both McMichael and Green took bumps while pulling off some moves of their own. In the end though, Deborah came walking down the ramp with Woman and Miss Elizabeth, and Deborah presented Steve with a briefcase. Inside the briefcase was a Four Horsemen shirt along with a lot of money, and it only took Steve mere seconds before he turned his back on Kevin. Flair and Anderson won the match, Steve helped the two beat up Randy Savage. McMichael then put on the Horseman shirt and it was made official. Steve McMichael was now a member of the Four Horsemen. Steve becoming a member of the Four Horsemen drew criticism from a lot of fans. The Horsemen were, at one point, considered an elite faction where only the best would gain entry. There were former members who also didn't fit the bill, of course. Many point to Paul Roma when talking about the worst members of the group. But Steve had yet to prove himself in the ring, and many old school fans felt that Steve becoming a Horseman was just a really bad joke. It's been said that Arn Anderson was the one who selected Steve to be a member. Flair was also very friendly with McMichael and the two had become drinking buddies away from the ring. Either way, it all comes down to what's presented on TV, and Steve was definitely a curious choice to join the group. Anyway, Steve's morals would align with those of his fellow peers. He would back up his Horseman teammates during their matches. He was now getting put in matches that weren't as meticulously planned out as his debut match at the Great American Bash, and this is when the lack of training really got brought to the forefront. He had a singles match at Bash at the Beach 1996 against Joe Gomez, and it simply wasn't good. As a matter of fact, it was atrocious. Gomez wasn't in the same league as Steve's Great American Bash opponents, and therefore there was no one there to direct McMichael and ensure things went as smoothly as they could. This presented a problem. The newest member of the Four Horsemen looked pretty bad here on a WCW pay-per-view, so to try to combat this, Steve was put in a lot of tag team matches moving forward. He would get little ring time and he'd be sure to tag out before things got too hectic. But even in those brief moments, Steve would still make mistakes or take some pretty awkward and funny looking bumps that fans can still recall to this very day. I don't want this to come across as a video that pokes fun at the guy because, as stated, Steve McMichael wasn't afforded the same amount of training that his peers benefited from. He tried his best with what he was given, but he was in the ring with some real seasoned pro wrestlers on one of the biggest wrestling shows in the entire world. This was always bound to happen. It wouldn't be the last time WCW would throw someone in the ring without adequate training either, case in point David Flair, but I digress. Steve would continue wrestling these tag team matches. He and Chris Benoit would get a win on pay-per-view against the Faces of Fear, and then the decision was made to move Steve into his first big singles feud against Jeff Jarrett. Jeff was another veteran who had enough experience to lead Steve's matches, so this should have been a positive for the former Chicago Bears defensive tackle. When Jeff Jarrett arrived at WCW in 1996, he wanted to be a Horseman. Ric Flair was also very keen on this idea, but the other Horsemen weren't very fond of Double J, particularly Arn Anderson and Chris Benoit. McMichael grew to despise Double J when Deborah took an interest in Jeff, and it was never made clear exactly what the relationship was between these two, but it was enough to make Steve feel a little envious as Deborah began helping Jeff secure match victories, even when Double J was facing the Four Horsemen. Deborah and Double J were causing friction within the group. Mrs. McMichael also had issues with women, so that was making Benoit get more and more angry with each passing week. But Ric Flair still wanted Jeff to become a Horseman. Flair felt Double J was worthy of joining the group even though all 4 membership cards were already claimed. So a match was booked for Super Brawl 7, Steve McMichael versus Jeff Jarrett. If Double J could beat Steve, then he'd become an official member of the Four Horsemen. Steve wouldn't lose his place in the group, there'd just be 5 horsemen instead of 4. It was because of Deborah that Jarrett ended up beating Steve on this night. Steve wanted Deborah to hand over his briefcase, but she ended up throwing it over his head. This allowed Double J to grab the weapon and McMichael got smacked. Double J wins via pinfall and Jeff Jarrett is now an official member of the Four Horsemen. The very next night, Steve teamed up with Double J to take on the Public Enemy. Strangely, Deborah was by her husband's side and it looked like all had already been forgiven. But in the end, McMichael got revenge by hitting Jarrett with his briefcase and Double J lost the match via pinfall. Ric Flair and Arn Anderson were not happy with how this went down. The Four Horsemen needed unity, seeing as the Dungeon of Doom were adding new members and the NWO were running roughshod all over WCW. The veterans of the Horsemen made Jarrett and Steve shake hands, and this meant McMichael had no choice but to continue teaming up with Double J, knowing full well that his wife had a thing for Mr. Jarrett. As it would turn out, the team of Double J and Steve McMichael were pretty successful together. They didn't win any tag team gold, but they did get quite a few victories on Monday Nitro. The months would go on, and for a moment, it seemed like WCW had forgotten about the storyline and these two seemed destined to tag forever. But Steve was actually getting prepared for another few singles matches on pay-per-view that had nothing to do with Double J or the Horsemen. No, Reggie White of the Green Bay Packers was coming into WCW to have a match against Steve McMichael at Slamboree, and following this, Kevin Green was coming back for a match against McMichael at the Great American Bash. This should have been a cause for concern due to the lack of overall experience that would be inside the ropes for these two matches, and yeah, the first one in particular was quite a disaster, unfortunately. Reggie White vs Steve McMichael was put in the semi-main spot at Slamboree 97, and it mostly consisted of the competitors walking around the ring, running into each other and applying headlocks. Now, to be fair, I'm sure Reggie White was getting a huge payday for this appearance, and you can't blame him for stepping inside the ropes for some of that sweet Turner money. And also, the crowd that attended Slamboree did get a kick out of the match, but man, watching this one at home was, and still is, pretty rough. Another thing I'll give Reggie credit for is his dropkick right here, but all in all, this is a match that you really don't want to sit through. It plods along, and you get that blind leading the blind feeling as these two try to waste as much time as possible from bell to bell. Steve already needed someone to guide him in the ring, and seeing as he had more experience than his opponent here at Slamboree, it was up to Steve to keep Reggie on the right path. There are moments where you can definitely see they were planned out in advance, but it was just bad. Again, it's Bischoff using name recognition to sell tickets. He would do it again with Karl Malone, he would do it with Dennis Rodman, even Jay Leno was brought in for a pay-per-view match, so really the top brass at WCW did not care if these guys weren't properly trained. So while these kind of matches may bring in curious new viewers for a quick pay-per-view buy, long-time fans could see right through it, and this kind of alienation of the core fan base would continue frequently in WCW. It's an attraction match, which is totally fine, but it was also a terrible attraction match. In the end, Jeff Jarrett helped McMichael win by passing him his briefcase, Reggie got knocked out, and Steve won via pinfall. Soon afterwards, Kevin Green was looking a little payback for what Steve did to him a year prior, and so Steve would get inside the ring once again for a pay-per-view singles match against a football player. As stated, I did like Kevin quite a bit in WCW, and he definitely had way more charisma as a pro wrestler in comparison to Reggie White, but it's a similar story here, unfortunately. This one is more watchable than the Slamboree match though, thanks to McMichael and Green having a bit of history together in WCW. Kevin also brings a lot of energy to the ring, and you can see he was enjoying what he was doing. If you were to watch either of these singles matches, I would definitely recommend this one over the Reggie White match, but it still won't make anyone's top 10 lists anytime soon. At the end of the day, the guys involved made money, so fair play to them. It just would have been nice if WCW took the time to get everyone prepared for the ring, no matter how long it took. This time, Double J cost Steve the match when he accidentally hit him with the briefcase. Kevin Green wins via pinfall, and yeah, I do wish we saw more of Kevin in WCW. I don't know what the general consensus is when it comes to his football career or how he's generally perceived by football fans, but I did enjoy his work in World Championship Wrestling. In the summer of 1997, Jeff Jarrett was kicked out of the Four Horsemen, and Deborah decided to leave Steve. She ended up becoming Double J's manager. McMichael got a little payback by beating Jarrett at the 35th Clash of the Champions show in Nashville, and Steve also took Double J's US title on this evening. Besides Great American Bash 1996, where Steve became a Horseman, this was probably the biggest night of his pro wrestling career. The US Championship was always considered WCW's second major title, so it was a big accomplishment here for Steve McMichael. His in-ring work was also improving, though it was still far from perfect. But what should be becoming evident here is that Steve McMichael had to really try and learn this job as he went along. This isn't all that uncommon when you think about it, seeing as everyone improves over time, but most other wrestlers get plenty of time to get better in the ring through working house shows and live events. Steve McMichael did not. He was very rarely featured at live events, which was probably due to his contract. The first time he went on a house show loop was in late summer 1998, and by then he was already coming up to the end of his pro wrestling career. Anyway, when McMichael won the US title, the Four Horsemen were reigniting their rivalry with the NWO. Curt Hennig had agreed to take a retired Arn Anderson spot in an upcoming War Games match against the New World Order, and at Fall Brawl 97, Hennig would turn his back on the Horsemen to join Hogan and company. It was McMichael who submitted in the War Games match. He only gave up so Hennig wouldn't slam a cage door on Rick's head, but Curt still did it anyway. The night after Fall Brawl on Nitro, Steve dropped the US title to Hennig in the main event match, and soon after, Flair would disband the Horsemen. Flair said Mongo didn't need him anymore, but I don't know. Steve had been a Horseman since he began his in-ring career, but now he would have to go solo. So he would pick up where he left off with Deborah and Jeff Jarrett. He began a rivalry with a forgotten faction featuring a group of wrestlers who also benefited from Deborah's managerial services. Jeff Jarrett, Eddie Guerrero and Alex Wright were under Deborah's guidance, and these three men would all have matches against Steve at one point or another. But this strange and random little group would soon disband too when they realised Deborah wasn't doing them any favours. Deborah would then get involved with a new WCW superstar named Bill Goldberg. Goldberg didn't say a lot and he didn't share many of his thoughts during his initial few weeks on Nitro, but he and Steve McMichael almost immediately butted heads, and thus Steve became one of Goldberg's very early victims as Billy Boy began his win streak. At Halloween Havoc 1997, Steve wrestled Alex Wright and Goldberg interfered. It was hilarious how long Charles Robinson was distracted for as McMichael took a spear and a jackhammer, plus Goldberg lifted Alex up to help him cover Steve. All this was enough to give Alex the win, and as a form of payment, Deborah gave Goldberg Steve's Super Bowl ring. Goldberg also attacked Alex after the match just because he could, but now Steve was on a mission to reclaim his property that this newcomer just stole from him. For a few weeks, Goldberg would come out during McMichael's matches just to taunt him while wearing the Super Bowl ring. But then, at the next WCW pay-per-view, World War III, Steve got his ring back after smacking Goldberg with a lead pipe. He also got revenge by beating Alex Wright at this pay-per-view, and all this would lead to a Goldberg vs McMichael match at Starrcade 97 that Goldberg would win pretty easily. Starrcade 97 is one of those pay-per-views that many fans who are just discovering WCW tend to visit first, seeing as it's so infamous and so well documented on the internet. This also means it's the first time many fans get exposed to Steve McMichael in a WCW ring, and once again, the performance isn't all that great, unfortunately. Next up, Steve would enter a short feud with the British Bulldog, a wrestler who just returned to WCW following the Montreal Screwjob in November 1997. The rivalry began at the very start of 1998, and you'd think Davey would take the same role as Double J here, as in he was a veteran who would do his best to make Steve's matches as good as they could be. Well, the Davey boy who arrived at WCW was, without exaggeration, a complete mess. It's no secret that Davey was taking all sorts during this particular time in his life, and his in-ring performances definitely reflected that. Though the Davey boy vs McMichael rivalry did give us this little gem of a moment right here.
And don't stand there drinking coffee when a man's talking to you, Davey boy!
Steve would wrestle Bulldog at Super Brawl 8. It was about as good or as bad as you'd expect it to be. To be fair though, Steve legitimately broke his arm during this bout when he hit the ring post, yet he still finished the match. The referee ended up awarding the victory to Bulldog when Steve couldn't escape an armbar submission. McMichael would then take time off before returning in June of 1998, and by the time he got back, Deborah had left WCW. Steve and Deborah went through a divorce. Eric Bischoff stated on his podcast that the divorce affected Steve pretty deeply, and Deborah would end up showing up in WWF, where she was paired up once again with Jeff Jarrett. Back in WCW, Steve was part of the famous Four Horsemen reunion that took place in September of 98. He seemed eager and pretty pleased that the group was back together, but Steve wouldn't be featured much on TV, and instead he wrestled quite a bit on that house show loop I talked about earlier on. As the weeks and months went on, Steve seemed a little checked out when it came to pro wrestling in general. He didn't get used as much when Ric Flair became the on-screen president of the company, but Eric Bischoff would explain that Steve was having a tough time personally, what with the split from Deborah and other things going on in his home life that Eric didn't fully explain. You could definitely see it during Steve's final TV appearances. He looked like he hadn't slept in days as he made his way down to the ring for his final match. And in that match, he got a bucket of water and bleach thrown over him before he decided to call it quits. When you think about it, Steve actually got out at the right time. His final appearance happened on the 8th of February 1999, and WCW would seriously go downhill from this point onwards. Maybe Steve was the glue that held everything together and we just didn't know it. So that was Steve McMichael's entire run in WCW. It's a hard one to sum up because, again, I can't lie about his abilities as a pro wrestler, and at the time, Steve wasn't really taken seriously by folks who followed pro wrestling. That being said, there is something oddly endearing about watching Steve perform in the ring. He did get thrown in the deep end and he would try his best to bump around the ring. The effort was most definitely there, but the way he would fall or the way he would try to perform certain moves could sometimes look very awkward. Because of this though, you're kinda glued to your screen watching Steve perform. The unpredictability factor is truly off the scale, and you don't know if Steve's gonna pull off moves perfectly or if he's gonna mess it up. In an ironic and roundabout way, it adds an element of realism to his matches that was purely unintentional. Maybe football fans clicked on this video having no idea about Steve's wrestling career or how wrestling fans perceive Steve as an in-ring performer. So I'll say this. A huge portion of fans who take wrestling for what it is actually got a kick out of Steve McMichael's performances, and it doesn't come from a bad or disrespectful place. It's more like an that's our Mongo kind of way, where we just enjoyed seeing how his matches played out while wondering if it's going to be a good performance or another botchy performance. To be fair, it was usually the latter, and I'm not going to say that fans didn't get a laugh out of Steve's matches. God knows I laughed quite a lot while covering his run on Reliving the War, but that doesn't mean I nor other people didn't look forward to his matches either. You never quite knew what you were going to get when McMichael stepped in the ring, and you felt a sense of joy when he got through a match from bell to bell without any major hiccups. So deep down, I think Steve became this underdog who we would all root for, and if it didn't work out, well, there was always next week. He was an integral part of the early days of Monday Nitro. His work on commentary along with Bischoff and Heenan set the tone for the pre-NWO days of WCW's flagship television show, and he also competed in the company when they were dominating the WWF. Honestly, if I'm watching old episodes of Nitro or old WCW pay-per-views, I rarely skip over Steve's matches even if I know they were bad. Just for this video alone, I only wanted to grab some video and images of his match against Reggie White, but I ended up getting drawn into whatever magic spell Big Steve cast on me, and I sat through the whole match again. It was terrible, no doubt, but I just wanted to see it play out again because of McMichael's in-ring work. Maybe the best way to put it is, it's so bad it's good, and I mean that in the best way possible. Steve McMichael has a legacy in the world of pro football. He wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame if that wasn't the case. And as far as this era of WCW goes, his peers always speak very highly of him, and I do think Steve left a lasting impression on fans who watched the guy perform. I think even the most jaded fans would crack a smile when you bring up the name Steve McMichael, and hey, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about really, isn't it? Thanks for watching guys, I hope you enjoyed this one, and please take care.